Vocal compression is hard. The number one thing I hear from artists that I mix for is that they are not happy with how the vocal sounds, and typically that comes down to compression. It feels over compressed, it feels under compressed, it feels like the vocal's sitting on top of the music and not in it. All of these problems come up, and so I wanted to talk about vocal compression today, to talk about kind of three main steps that I use to get vocals tamed dynamically and fitting into a track. Because vocals are one of the most important elements, if not the most important element, in virtually every song. It's what draws the listener in. So we're going to jump into a session on one of my songs called Spinning, and I'm going to show you how I approach this.
Life is a maze with mirrors on every wall. We're hitting dead ends and nothing makes sense at all.
So my first step in compressing vocals is preparing them for the compression with EQ. So I have an instance of Pro Q4 here, which I'll turn on. And you can see I already did some EQ moves. I'm going to bypass these for now. And we're not going to adjust this just yet, but you need an EQ loaded up right before your compression, because a lot of times people are recording really close to microphones. You're getting a buildup of bass, and that extra low end in the voice is kind of the number one thing that's ruining your vocal compression. That's making it sound over compressed or like it's pulling away from you in the mix. So by addressing that first, you're going to make the compression sound so much better. So we're going to circle back to that, but next we're going to add a fast attack compressor. So this is step 2. Add a fast attack compressor. We're going to use an 1176 because that's a great compressor for almost every song, any vocal. It's versatile, it's fast, it has fast attack times and release times, so it's perfect for catching the peaks of the vocal. That's the first thing we want to do, is really catch the most aggressive peaks and kind of tame those and pull them in. So you want to do a moderately slow attack. So on the 1176, you can see it's reversed. So this is the slowest attack, and then this is medium, this is fastest. So we're going to go somewhere around 3 is where I like to start. And then the fastest release, or sometimes you can pull off that if you want it to be a little bit smoother sounding. But yeah, and then I'm just going to dial in some gain reduction. I want to see almost every word compressed except for the quietest words. So it's going to usually be somewhere around 6 to 10 dB of compression.
The nights become days and days all blur into one. Losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
So you can hear on Sun, it's just barely compressing. So that's what we want. It's a good amount of compression. And I'm going to go ahead and bypass all of the other effects going on, except for maybe some slap back and reverb, so it's not completely dry. Just so we can really focus in on how the vocal sounds. Because what I want to hear first, I want to compress the vocal without any EQ and just kind of address, does this sound good?
The nights become days and days all blur into one.
It sounds okay, but what I'm hearing is just a lot of kind of this sense of like puffiness, like it doesn't feel like it's coming closer to me with the compression. What I do next is I bring up an EQ, and I'm gonna play this back, and I bring in a low cut filter. So this is really just to get rid of any rumbly information below the range of the vocal. But I'll also use it with kind of like a gentle slope, like 12 dB per octave. And this helps tame some of the lowest notes of the vocal. So I'll use that to my advantage by adjusting the Q value and the placement, just so it's not cutting off all the low end of the vocal, but it's starting to kind of gently roll it off. So I'm gonna play this back and do that first,
The nights become days and days all blur into one. I'm losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
So now those lowest notes don't feel as overwhelming, and it's starting to feel more balanced, but oftentimes there's like a little bit of kind of muddy boxiness to the vocal that I'm noticing too. So reducing a little bit, within 200 to 400 hertz can really help ease that mid-range congestion that makes it sound boxy, or it can even make it sound over compressed. So let's play around with that.
The nights become days and days all blur into one. I'm losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
So yeah, just tucking that in a little bit just makes everything feel more balanced. And obviously I'm in solo right now. So this isn't like the final EQ. We're not trying to get it to its end goal right now. We're just trying to make sure the compression and the tone of the vocal sound balanced together. And one thing you'll notice is when I do this EQ and we look at the compression gain reduction, we're not compressing as hard.
The nights become days and days all blur into one. I'm losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
So in some cases, you might even want to, increase the input to drive more compression after you take out some of the low end. In this case, I think it sounds nice. It sounds like balanced as is. So I'm going to roll with that. And then step 3 on this is some slow attack compression. Slow attack, slow release. We're going to do more gentle leveling of the vocal. So for this, I do find it helpful to have it in the context of the music so you can hear that it's kind of riding on top of the music. So let's just listen back to it right now as is.
Nights become days and days all blur into one. I'm losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
Now it's pretty good, but I do want additional dynamic control. So I'm going to bring up the LA2A, and usually I'm looking for between 1 to 5 dB of compression here. That's just going to kind of smooth out the overall level. It's really simple with this compressor, so that's why I like it. I don't have to mess with settings.
Nights become days and days all blur into one. I'm losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
So that's sounding good. And on this, I actually did pre-EQ as well. So you can kind of apply the same technique that I used for the last stage of compression, where once you're listening to it in the mix, you might find, oh, there's still a little bit too much low end. It's sounding just a little bit muddy or not as like upfront as I want. So I might do some additional, here I have some dynamic EQ that's kind of bringing down and controlling that low end. A little bit more scooping of the mid-range and then boosting some presence. And I didn't want it to be too airy, so I brought that down. So let's listen to how that sounds with the compression.
Nights become days and days all blur into one.
Without the EQ.
Nights become days and days all blur into one.
So that's sounding good to me. It might sound too thin to you, but the other thing to factor in is when you start adding reverbs and delays and other effects, sometimes cutting out that extra low end helps to keep the clarity and keep the vocal feeling not too just congested in the mix. So if you have like a vocal that's really up front and it's like pretty dry and it's mixed more like a pop record, then you probably don't need to cut as much low end as I'm doing here. But again, that's just a matter of taste. And what you also saw is as I boosted the presence, it actually drove the compression a little bit differently too. So that's a huge takeaway here. One thing you always want to do is look at the relationship between the EQ and the compression, especially EQ coming before the compression, and use that to your advantage. Low end driving a compressor typically doesn't sound good on vocals. It makes it sound more natural. And in some cases, boosting more high end or at least more mid-range presence into a compressor can actually improve intelligibility without getting too harsh. So that's how I approach compression. Those are kind of the 3 steps. So EQ, fast attack compression, slow attack compression, and then typically in 9 out of 10 cases, that's gonna do it for me in terms of dynamically controlling the vocal and getting it to sit in the mix really well. But sometimes you run into vocals that are, super, super dynamic. The compression just sounds like not enough, or when you drive it harder, it sounds over compressed. So what can you do in that circumstance? Well, here are 2 tips that are going to help you out there. So the first is using clip gain. So this is where you actually are going in and you're cutting up individual regions and you're adjusting their gain to like even out the overall amplitude of these waveforms to make sure they're hitting the compressor in a very uniform way. Sometimes you'll have to go in and re-automate some of the dynamics back in, and that's totally okay. But my goal usually first is to get an even vocal that's going to feed into the compressor and allow it to perform more consistently. And then with the dynamic vocal, one thing I'll do is I'll try, don't be afraid to drive the compressor super hard. So if you have a really dynamic vocal and you're trying to get it to sit, sometimes you need 10 to 15 or more dB of compression to get it to sit. So let's pretend this is really dynamic.
The nights become days and days all blur into one. I'm losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
So you can hear those S's start to pop up, and this is where a de-esser is going to be really important. But you're getting a really upfront vocal sound. It's sounding a little bit more like a pop record in that way. But you might not like how aggressive that sounds. You might want to dial that back further. Let's say we want that dynamic control, but it's sounding too aggressive. You can do parallel compression. So you can either duplicate the track and add compression only to one of the channels, or in this case, we have a mix knob. So I can just...
The nights become days and days all blur into one.
I can dial that back.
Nights become days and days all blur into one.
And usually around 50 or 60%, it starts to relax and you're still getting a lot of dynamic control, but it doesn't feel so aggressive.
Nights become days and days all blur into one. I'm losing my balance, spinning around the sun.
So for this song, I wouldn't use quite that much compression. It's not really needed, but that can be a really helpful tool when you do have a very dynamic vocalist and you need to control. And then additionally, like I mentioned, use automation after the compression to really emphasize the dynamics. Maybe you need to bring back down some of the quiet parts. Maybe you need to do some additional tailoring of the ends of words to get them to sit right in the mix. Spend plenty of time getting this right because it's really important to do. So anyway, that's how I approach compression. I hope that was really helpful. And one thing to keep in mind is that anytime you learn a mix technique, you need to practice it and you need to develop an ear for it. So don't be discouraged if you mix a vocal and you're like, this sounds great. And then in 2 years, you listen back to it and you're like, what was I doing? That's way overcompressed or undercompressed or weird. That shows that you're growing and your ear is getting better when you're able to identify, okay, my past work sounded bad for these reasons. So that should happen, and you can't really shortcut that process. All you can do is just mix a bunch of songs and experiment with these techniques until your ear kind of adjusts to what it wants to hear. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have questions down in the comments.
I'm dizzy from